Welcome back to Real Estate Radio TV, the commercial real estate focused media, for an exclusive interview on real estate private equity recruiting. In today's interview, we have the great honor to welcome Jamie McCord, specialist in real estate private equity recruiting. In today's interview, we are going to touch on many different topics, including the keys in getting into private equity, setting yourself apart during the recruiting process, culture variation between small and large cap funds, as well as regional focus, and the current recruiting market with the ongoing capital markets headwind. Jamie, how are you today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. What about yourself?
Very great. It's great to have you on and actually conduct our first interview on real estate private equity. Recruiting kind of changing ways from our traditional interviews, but it's definitely a topic of interest for our listeners, for companies, and people looking to get into real estate private equity. So before we diving and touch on all the great topics we've planned for today's interview, Jamie, I want you to give us a brief presentation of yourself, business background, as well as where do you specialize within the recruiting process.
Sure, not a problem. So I work for a business called Novus Executives. So we're a specialist search firm into the finance sector, generally in London, but we do operate across Europe as well. I myself I'm a director here, and we head up the real estate head up the real estate space. So I focus on sort of investment professionals, generally with buy side firms. So I work with everything from sort of private equity funds to investment managers, propco firms, but also some platform businesses and logistics markets as well, but predominantly private equity. And I would say sort of the sweet spot of where I work is kind of from start up to 5-6 billion AUM. That's generally where the majority of my work comes from.
And private equity is an industry that is attracting a lot of professionals, either getting straight out of university, of people, already working in finance as an investment banker, or maybe from an accounting perspective. So a lot of demand and a few jobs. So really, what are the keys into successfully getting and entering into private equity, and more specifically into real estate private equity in today's market?
I think it really depends on the level. I think you could look at this in two ways, where you start with junior candidates maybe coming out of school. I think the first thing is that private equity is a very tight, small industry. So going to a really good school, obviously the UK, we've got Oxford, Cambridge, and maybe some of the Russell groups below that, or in Paris, HEC, or those sorts of schools around the world. That's kind of where you probably need to start from in that direction. I think coming out of school, the key things probably are to try and get into an internship program. That would be the sort of number one way to start your journey into this space. I know they're also very competitive, but you kind of need to have that exposure. And if you want to get into real estate specifically, having that sort of initial internship in a private equity fund or a bank specializing in real estate is really where you want to go, because the skill set you really need for an analyst level role is probably linked to three things. You want to have strong numerical modeling skill set, you want to be really strong on Excel, and you need to have very strong PowerPoint skills. That's generally the feedback we get from all of our clients, and the only way to develop that skill set is to start getting an internship, or I think a lot of people will look at starting their journey to PE by going to an investment bank. They are natural places to get that training. When you become a bit more senior, it's kind of making that step across from an investment bank. I think from the peak years to make a move across would be sort of 1 to 5 years. So that would equate to analyst to associate level. That's where you would see a lot of transition across, because they've got the skill set that private equity funds need. If you are sort of more like a senior associate, so you're talking 6-7 years of experience, that's where it can become a bit more difficult to make the transition across, because at that point funds will want you to lead or originate deals, so you aren't going to have that exposure in the bank. So I think at that point you still need to have exceptional numerical and modeling skill set, but you really need to sort of push that you can bring on that business. So that can be a trickier one, but that's what you kind of got to show to a private equity fund to make it across. So I think in conclusion, it's not an easy road, but those are the sorts of backgrounds I think would help people make that transition.
And real estate is really only a small part of the financial sector, and investment banking is very wide, working across many different industries. But how is important for someone wanting to get specifically into real estate private equity to acquire real estate skill set from a financial perspective, but also from an operational perspective, because real estate is much more than financial. So how is that important to have that kind of experience wanting to enter into the real estate private equity market?
No, well, look, that is it's very important, that point, because you've got to sell your story to companies. The majority of people in private equity funds, particularly real estate private equity funds, are passionate about real estate, and they're so driven by the space that you have to show that. So I think it's not completely out of the realms of possibility to come into this area having not done an internship or had a previous experience in it, but it's amazing how much it can help when you've started to look at it even during your school days, or when you're at university, to start looking at that sector and get your internships in that area. It helps sell the story, and that's what this a lot of the time it is about. It's your story, how believable is it to get into real estate private equity, because if you can't sell that to these people, they're probably going to turn you down, unfortunately. So I can't say how important that is. It's just that it's up there with everything else I've already stated.
And we mentioned, maybe starting from an investment banking career, but a lot of people, kind of start on the brokerage side of real estate if they have a passion for real estate. And, 1, 2, 3 years realize that maybe the buy side, the investment side is most likely what they would be looking for. Based on your experience, is it possible to make that transition from a brokerage, real estate operational side to a buy side and investment side?
It can happen. It's just tougher. I think the number one option is the investment banking background because of the training skill set that they need to go in. And that comes from the majority of private equity funds I deal with. I think if you are sort of looking to move into the sector, the advice I always give to people is look at the people that are in those funds. If you're coming from a JLL, a CBRE, and the people in the fund you're applying to are ex-Goldman or whatever bulge bracket it is, your chance of getting in on the investment side are probably limited. It's not impossible, but definitely there is a preference to have the similar sort of background. Whereas if the people in the fund have had this come from more like a surveying background, then it's a lot easier to transition into that type of fund. So that's the big advice I would give on it. And the other thing that those people will be looked at more for is their sort of numerical analysis and modelling skills, because it's not my view, it's the fund's view a lot of the time that the banks are better for it. So they'll be analysing people who come from a brokerage side. So if you're coming from that direction, it's important to really be nailed on for those tests when they arise.
And one of the key things, once you start building that background and experience is really the recruiting process in itself, from identifying the right companies where you can see a potential fit with what you're looking for, to reaching out to them either directly or through a recruiting agent like yourself, to really, kind of sell yourself up to the interview process and hopefully get hired. So really, in this timeline, which can be pretty long, what are the keys to really set yourself apart?
I think, look, first thing is obviously having your CV. That's the first thing that people see. So the standard for the industry is about 1 to 2 pages, generally 1 page. That it's kind of the old school investment banking profile CV. It was always 1 page, but I think the key things is to highlight your academics. You want to make sure your university's listed, grades are listed, But the key information that's on there is your deal experience. If you've worked on sort of 5 deals over the past 12 months, maybe not in this current market, but historically, if you've done that, you want to make sure that's highlighted on the CV. And again, some of it can be private and confidential, but look, people sort of, most of the deals that are done, there's project names, so you can include that, location, asset class value. Those are the sorts of things that are key to being on a CV. In terms of the application process, it's really the individual's call whether they want to use a recruiter or not. What you'll probably find is smaller funds will usually go out via a recruiter because they don't have internal HR. Some of the bigger names will advertise online. The only issue when you go into some of those processes, you don't have that sort of third party who can advise with the process, sort of giving you the overview on culture, the overview of the team and who you'd be working with, and the interview process as well. So that can be the tricky bit if you apply directly. And also when it comes to the business end of negotiations, it's always helpful to have a recruiter who, especially one that knows the market, knows what salaries are, that what you're being offered is in line with the market. So that's why I always push to say work with a recruiter. Obviously, I'm very biased on that side. That's me. So I'm going to push that. But I think that you can apply directly. It's just in this industry, it tends to be sort of the insurance funds, the pension funds, and maybe some of the bigger funds that do it. The rest don't have the big internal HR team. So you probably need a recruiter to help with that.
And switching gears, because you talk also about funds recruiting, and over the past couple of years, I mean, private equity in general and real estate, private equity in particular has grown a lot, with a lot of LPs wanting to allocate more capital into private equity, as we saw through different reports, and so a lot of funds being created. When you're an emerging fund and really do not have a major track record as a fund, how do you attract talent, to come and work at your fund?
I think it depends on how well set up they are. I think the obvious one to make it very easy to attract people is if they've just raised capital, especially in this current market. It's such a big sell. Even if it's a couple of 100 million for a small fund, that could be 6-7 deals. So that's sort of the obvious point. The other things would be sort of to sell on the type of culture. What I find when I recruit for smaller funds is I generally attract people who have worked in a bigger name and want to make a change in sort of career, whether that's lifestyle, getting the work-life balance, but also maybe being able to work and partner with somebody a bit more senior in the market, because sometimes with a bigger fund, you could be in a pool of associates and your space time with the more senior people is limited. So I think culture, being able to work quite closely with these types of people, the senior people, and capital are probably 3 big things that I would sort of push towards. But it's quite a tough one to answer without being sort of specific on each individual fund on that one.
And in terms of the culture, because that's something we keep hearing about, is the culture in finance, the culture in investment banking and private equity. And your specialty mostly is working, like you said, with small mid-cap funds, 1 to 10 billions in asset under management. Really, what are the main differences that you see in the culture environment, between small, medium-cap funds to large mega funds?
It's a very different environment. Some small funds that I deal with have 4 people, or sort of generally the funds I place a lot of people with are anywhere between 4 and 20 people, whereas some of the bigger private equity shops have thousands of people across the globe. That simple dynamic changes things. It's a leaner corporate structure, so it's going to feel like a very different environment. In terms of sort of work-life balance, I generally find that some of the smaller funds maybe offer a bit better sort of lifestyle. Again, that's not completely fair across the market, because if you're in a 4-person startup, I expect you're going to be working quite long hours. I think the bigger difference is just the way they view deals. a big shop is probably going to analyze every big deal on the market. So you're going to have to be in the office a lot more to do that, and maybe working incredibly long hours. At the same time as that, you're never going to have to worry about capital within these funds. You're going to be doing a lot of deals, and let's face it, remuneration is going to be pretty good. So those things are strong. Whereas in a smaller fund, you probably aren't analysing every deal in the market, and your involvement in the deal is probably greater. So you sometimes can get that balance on the work-life side. You can get to work with the senior people. But so that's a different one. It's hard to go into too much without going into specific firms, to be honest, about what the culture's like in general. But that's kind of a brief overview of some of the differences.
And talking about building your expertise, I think one of the common themes is that sometimes, in smaller, medium cap funds, you can have faster responsibilities, go to clients' meetings. For example, in real estate, the MIPIM can happening every year. Then a larger fund where you have to really climb up the ladder, becoming an executive or senior to really be able to attend those events. I mean, is that something that you're also seeing in terms of the culture difference?
Yeah, definitely. I think I don't want to say that it's the same for every fund, but there's a lot of smaller funds I deal with where people are getting to sort of associate earlier, VP earlier, director earlier, and they have the culture a lot of the time where it's a meritocracy. If you are delivering, you go up. So you can be rewarded quite well in that way. Whereas at some of the bigger names, as much as you're performing, you've got sort of another pool of associates, VPs, and if one goes up way before the other, that can cause conflict. So it tends to be sort of 3-year cycles for each person. So that's definitely a big difference. The other thing linked to that actually is smaller funds tend to give carried interest to people a little bit earlier than the big names. So and that's where it becomes very attractive for firms or for candidates when they're looking at these firms, because that's where sort of the bigger paydays come in over the coming years.
And you mentioned a little bit about the recruiting market, but I want to get your thoughts really on today's capital markets headwinds that we're all witnessing in commercial real estate, like in many different other sectors. But commercial real estate has been quite a bit impacted. So what impact did that have on the current recruiting? Do you see firms still actively recruiting, a turnover? I mean, what is going on in the market?
Yeah, compared to this time last year, it's a very different market. That's probably the most obvious statement out there, given the deal flow is down. But I'm always the opinion that hiring is, especially investment hiring, is 3 months behind the market. Deal flow stopped this time, probably about April, May last year after the start of the war in Ukraine. And it was probably summertime when we saw an impact on hiring where firms didn't quite know how to respond to it, and a lot of the time went into hiring freezes. Then coming out of the summer, we had Liz Truss's incidents with the market over here, and that kind of put paid to a lot of hiring for a couple of months. But since then, there have been hires made. I wouldn't say we've been as busy as last year. I think last year was an exceptional year just with where the market was, but there's still firms hiring. It's just the volume is down, and the positions have changed compared to last year. Everybody wanted investment people last year. Now asset management is very much in demand, which makes sense because firms are really having to sweat their assets this year compared to last. So that's seen an increase. So I think at the moment it's still relatively slow. I think you'll get the same sort of picture from most places. There are probably some redundancies still going on, but the view from a lot of places that investment is starting to happen again. Repricing is starting to happen, and I think as that continues towards the end of the year, start of next, we'll see a real increase. But it doesn't mean people shouldn't look at this point that there are opportunities out there at the moment.
And how is that important, really, maybe sometimes to build relationship internally with some funds, for example, personal relationship working in those funds, really, maintaining those to potentially get inside a fund. How's that important to really maybe have some insiders in the fund working?
Do you mean sort of for a candidate's point of view or from
Yes,
my side?
yes, from a candidate's point of view.
I think from that side, it's important to be in touch. Especially, I feel this is more important at a more senior level. Once you become sort of past VP upwards, you need to have these relationships to be able to maybe make a transition across, or you never know, you could end up doing a deal with these people in the years to come. So it's more important than ever to be seen, to be in contact with these people. So it's certainly something that I recommend. I think from a moving right now perspective, for those candidates, I think it's probably tough at the moment. There aren't sort of huge numbers of sort of VP upward positions at this point, but realistically, that's not too dissimilar to most years. Once you go up the pyramid, there are less positions. It's just the way it works.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for coming in. It's been a great pleasure talking about real estate, private equity, recruiting. It's definitely a topic that is not really talked about, and really within real estate, radio, TV, well, the main goal is commercial real estate. That goes hand in hand because truly between real estate, between finance, there is people, there is human resources, which are the keys to make the business survive and thrive. And before we let you go, Jamie, any last words you want to mention to our audience? Maybe some advice, some insights, whatever you want to say.
I think probably linking it back to where the market is at the moment. I get for a lot of people, it's a tough position to be in at this point. There's a lot of uncertainty out there at the moment, but I think the biggest thing I would say is to be patient with the market. The last thing that you want to do is make a move and you're looking again in 6 months' time. If it's a case of sort of staying put for that period, developing your skill set, I would say that's a better option than sort of really pushing right now. And I've written sort of blogs and done sort of posts about this before, so it's what I'd certainly highlight at the moment. People who've made knee-jerk reactions have most likely in the main regretted it over the last 6 months. So being patient and getting the right rules is probably the way to go.
Well, Jamie, thank you for being here, and we'll make sure to include your different contact information, including your LinkedIn information in the bio if people are ever interested in reaching out, either from a candidate perspective or from a company perspective. They're more welcome to do so and follow you to get the latest news on recruiting. It's been a great pleasure, and guys, make sure you download our app. That's available and free on the App Store and Android. Until next time, see you.
Cheers.